we last left Peter stepping out of the boat, didn't we? Cliffhanger. So Peter's stepping out of the boat. He'd yelled to that figure out walking on the waves and the wind, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you in the water." And Jesus yells back through the howling wind, "Come." And Peter steps out and he walks on water. Peter walks on water. I know too often we want to jump ahead, but don't do that. Peter walks on water. We don't know exactly how far, but we do know that it was far enough away from the boat that he couldn't get easily back because he panics. Peter walks on water. Wow. I mean, that took faith. That took courage. Peter got to do something that only Jesus has done. Too often, when we're talking about this story, when we're preaching this story, we just jump ahead to Peter's failure. Don't go there yet. Imagine yourself in the boat with the others. You've heard Peter's request, you've heard Jesus' invitation, and now you're watching as your friend walks on water. The disciples must have had their faith expanded in that moment. Not only can Jesus do the miraculous, but now he's inviting us into the experience of the miraculous as well. Wow. I wonder if the others were just dead silent in shock. Or maybe they were whooping it up at the sight of Peter on the water. I do wonder if anybody else in the boat at least wanted to yell, "Jesus, can I come too?" But they didn't. I wonder if anyone missed the miracle because they were at the rudder or the oars or the jib and were saying, "Guys, the wind, get back to your posts." Peter walks on water. He's the only one who steps out of the boat. 2 chapters later in Matthew, Jesus looks at Peter and says, "I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Somehow, Jesus uses Peter's step of faith to prepare Peter for leadership in the church. Okay, but then, what about Peter's failure? I mean, he sees, or at least becomes aware of, that the wind, he has been focused on Jesus, listening for his call, headed his way, but something causes Peter to lose his focus on Jesus and instead pay attention to the wind. Maybe the wind blows the hair in his eyes. Maybe a wave splashes him. Maybe he thinks, "Woohoo, look at me, I'm walking on water," and then freaks out. Maybe he hears a whoop from someone in the boat. Maybe he begins to wonder how this actually works, walking on water. But something causes Peter to switch his focus from Jesus, who has called him, to the wind and the waves around him that are working against him. And the result of paying attention to the wind and the waves is that Peter becomes afraid. Peter had enough faith to step out of the boat, but he didn't have enough faith to keep going. And in fear, he begins to sink. And as he's sinking, he cries out, "Lord, save me." And immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him. But they still have to get back to the boat. It seems that if they're still some distance from the boat, because if Peter had been close, he would have grabbed a hold. And so I picture Jesus putting his arm around Peter so that they can walk on water together back to the boat. And with the wind still howling, while they're walking on water with Jesus' arm supporting Peter, Jesus leans in so Peter can hear him, and he says, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" Now, I know sometimes people hear these words as Jesus shaming Peter. But I don't think it was meant to shame him at all. I think it was a true question that Jesus wants Peter to contemplate. And so, as they are together walking on water back to the boat, I imagine Peter asking himself the same thing. He's still out on the water, the wind is still blowing, but he's with Jesus, and he's fully able to fulfill what Jesus has called him to do. Why was his faith so small? Why did he doubt? This is Jesus, who Peter has already seen calm a storm and heal many and feed thousands. This was Jesus who had sent them out in twos to preach and to heal, and they'd done it. Why did he doubt this time? Why was his faith enough to step out of the boat, but not enough to keep walking to Jesus? You and I can't answer that question for Peter. But it's a good question for us when we're pursuing an invitation of faith. What causes us to doubt? When Jesus and Peter get back to the boat, that is when the wind calms down. Jesus waits to calm the wind until he and Peter get back to the boat. Jesus wanted Peter to walk in the storm with him so that Peter could discover that with Jesus he could do it. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. My prayer has been that in our time together, you would have gotten 1, 2, 10 things on that yellow card that may be steps of faith for your church. And in the days to come, you'll take them back to your church leaders and say, okay, let's pray about this. Is this an invitation from the Lord? And my continuing prayer is that this summer you'll hear the invitations of Jesus to step out of your safe boat and you'll step out in faith into some new territory. So I hope your list of faith steps, possibilities, has grown. But I'm guessing that as you've been writing these possibilities down, that at least one person has thought, what if we fail? What if we fail? As I've gone around the conference, I've had enough good, honest conversations to know there's a fear of failure here. What if we put all this effort into this new thing and nothing happens? What if someone leaves? What if a key giver leaves? What if no one new comes? What if we spend this money and deplete our reserves and then the furnace breaks? What if we can't pay the pastor's salary? What if this messes up the statistics? Oh, Superintendent Pam, we stepped out in faith before and we failed, so people don't want to step out in faith again. We might fail again. Friends, if we were guaranteed success, we wouldn't need faith. If you're a person with an active faith, I so appreciated what the bishop said, if you're a person with an active faith, you'll actually experience failure. So let me say that again. If you're a person with an active faith, you will experience failure. We don't have a prosperity gospel here. In my first session, I mentioned the heroes of faith from Hebrews 11, and during that session, I left out the verses that talk about people of true faith who were tortured, faced jeers, flogging, chains, imprisonment, were put to death by stoning, were sawed in two, were killed by the sword, were destitute, persecuted, mistreated. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. Reminds me of all the people that Yvonne was talking about. They stepped out in faith, truly, and that was the result. I don't expect that many of us will be tortured or killed for our faith. But when we begin to think that failure, or at least what the world calls failure, isn't part of our faith journey, this passage should remind us that we're wrong. Failure and suffering is part of faith. All these people in Hebrews 11 were commended for their faith. So when we step out of the boat, there is the real possibility that we can sink. But rather than fearing failure, we should expect it and embrace it and learn from it. After sinking in fear, Peter heard Jesus ask the question, "Why did you doubt?" It's a question for us too. Why do we doubt? Is it because of that time, that the Lord didn't answer the prayer the way we wanted him to? Is it because you've forgotten all the ways he's worked before? Is it because it's been so long since you took a step of faith that your faith muscle has gotten weak? Is it because you've begun to believe the lie that failure doesn't fit with faith, and you've failed so often that you start to think Jesus wasn't with you in the storm? What lie are you believing that causes you to doubt? Jesus says, oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? Have you come to believe the lie that Jesus isn't calling you into new places? Maybe you think Jesus calls other people to steps of faith, but not you. Or maybe you believe the lie that failure's final, but it's not. At least not when we learn from failure. We've got to learn how to fail well. So how do we fail well? Well, first, we learn from it. Peter did. He cried out for help to Jesus, and Jesus pulled him out of the water, and then together they started walking on the water. You know, you've heard that old line, if you fall off a horse, get back on. Peter sank into the waves, then got back up to walk on them again with Jesus back to the boat. And then Peter pondered the question, why did you doubt? We know we pondered it because I'm sure that he talked about it with Matthew, who wrote it down. So when we fail, asking the why question is really important. What can we learn from this failure? What can we learn about Jesus? What can we learn about us? What can we learn about what we're doing? One of the saddest things I see is leaders who want to blame everyone else when they fail rather than learning from the failure. I'm guessing that Peter walked on water differently on his way back to the boat than he did on his way out. He learned something from his failure. Sometimes, like Peter, failure is allowed in our lives because we forgot to stay focused on Jesus. So we have to ask, how do we better stay focused on Jesus next time? Sometimes failure is allowed in our lives so that, if we let it, failure can shape and mold our character to be more humble and gentle, like Jesus. Sometimes there are specific practices to learn from failure. As Peter walked with Jesus back to the boat, I wonder, did he learn that it was easier to walk on the crest of the waves rather than the trough? I don't know. So first, when you fail, learn from it. Second, know that Jesus will catch you when you cry out to him. Peter says, Lord, save me, and Jesus was there. He was there with learning questions. He was there to get Peter back walking on water. He was there to save. So how often is our fear of failure linked to some lurking lie that Jesus won't catch us? Jesus won't forsake us. What's the worst that can happen? We die and go to be with Jesus. But even in death, Jesus won't forsake us. So what are we so afraid of? That's what I love about hearing the stories from parts of the world where they are not afraid. Even in failure, Jesus is with us. The third piece of failing well is know that nothing done in true faith is wasted. 1 Corinthians 15:58 should encourage us. It says, always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. God will use that failure if you allow him to. It's not in vain. I'm guessing that what Peter learned in both his step in faith out of the boat and his sinking were vital to him leading the early church. Personally, over the past 2 years of being here, I've been amazed at how my failures have probably better prepared me for this role than my successes. If we fear failure, we won't step out of the boat. And can we not be ashamed of failure either among ourselves? We live in a time when the world desperately needs people of faith to step into new territory. The world may not see their need, but we do. We need to step out into new territory that the Lord leads us to. We need to step out into new neighborhoods and new cities and new towns and new territories. We need to reach new people, old, young, Rich, poor, black, brown, white. We need to be bold in sharing our faith, both in word and in deed. We need to be calling people into a deeper holiness, a more intimate walk with God. We need to step in to be reconcilers. We need to step in to be reconcilers in a world filled with hate. We need to stop settling and being stuck and replace it with active faith that moves us into action. And if we're going to be people of faith, we can't be afraid of failure. We have to expect it, embrace it, learn from it.